Hello everyone, I'm Marine Lefort and you are listening to Les Voix de la Photo, the podcast that gives voice to the professionals behind photography and visual culture. For the past 5 years, I've had the chance to speak with those who shape the field, from curators and editors to agents and institution leaders, diving into their journeys, insights and perspective on photography. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome Alona Pardo. Hello, Alona.
Hi, Marine. Lovely to be here with you.
And thank you for joining me in this podcast. You are a curator and writer based in London, and for over a decade, you were a curator at the Barbican Art Gallery, where you develop landmark photography and film exhibitions that explored politics, identity, and social change. Since January 2024, you've taken a new role as the director of the Arts Council collection after serving as head of programs there in 2023. Among your most acclaimed exhibitions are Masculinities, Liberation through Photography. I was really impressed by this exhibition in Arles. Dorothea Lange, Politics of Seeing, Another Kind of Life, and Strange or Familiar, co-created with Martin Parr, and a lot of other exhibitions. Your work is known for its depth, commitment to representation and exploration of how arts intersect with activism and community. In this conversation, I would love to explore your curatorial philosophy, the role of institutions, and how you see the future of photography evolving. To start from the beginning, my first question is always where did you grow up, and did anyone in your family or close friend have a special connection to photography or visual culture?
Well, thank you for that really lovely introduction. It's nice to reflect back on some of those projects. So I was born in London and raised in London. But I also lived in France while I was a teenager.
Where in France?
Down in the south of France, in Mougins, a small place where there is now actually a very nice photography centre in Mougins, in the village, which wasn't there when I was an adolescent. It would have been nice if there was. And no, I had no direct connection with photography. I always say photography kind of found me, but I had
what your parents do?
My parents loved going around galleries. I mean, commercial when we went on holiday, and they were always buying stuff, and I was surrounded by by works of art. I mean, nothing, valuable, but there was a deep connection to kind of to the visual language. And actually, one of my most earliest recollections of encountering art was here in London when I was still in primary school, and my mum took me to the Saatchi Gallery when it was still on Boundary Road, and I encountered work by Jeff Koons, which was I was 10, maybe 11, and it was really blown away by
what did you think at this time?
I mean, I don't know. I was confounded. I didn't know what to think. I mean, for me, art was very representational, and all of a sudden, I remember seeing Jeff Koons's, his, vacuum cleaners stacked in perspex boxes, one on top of the other, and I kind of became fascinated by what kind of visual representation could mean. I mean, I didn't put it in those terms then, but there was always I think very visually. So there was no direct relationship in the family to artists or creative ways of thinking, maybe, and creative ways of living, but not necessarily kind of visual expression of that. So that's the kind of the childhood background.
So at this time, do you know what you wanted to study? What did you study?
Well, no, I mean, I studied French and history of art, so quite a traditional route through to the arts. I mean, this was in the early 90s, so there wasn't a kind of look towards the contemporary. It was always kind of an art historical canon that was always looking backwards. But from quite a kind of formative age, in my kind of mid to late teens, I knew that I wanted to do something connected to museums, galleries. The word curator was quite a new thing to me. It was a new concept, and so I wasn't exactly sure of the trajectory and the direction I wanted to take, but there was certainly a kind of gravitational pull towards, kind of material visual culture, whether that was painting or photography or sculpture. And as I said, it was quite, the education at that time, it was a kind of, a very traditional pedagogical approach to art history, the Renaissance and kind of,
So where did you study?
I studied at the University of Edinburgh. So I studied French and history of art, and I have to say that actually my French studies were far more pertinent to ways of thinking. I had a wonderful tutor whose name I don't remember, who taught kind of French structural feminist theory, so Irigaray and Christeva, and it blew my mind. And actually my real interest came through this kind of intersection of kind of theoretical thinking or critical thinking, and how that kind of meshes onto or maps onto kind of visual culture. So yeah, my formation in the history of art was very nice, but it was really through kind of thinking through kind of a theoretical lens or framework that I came to understand that actually history of art or art could be something that was deeply political, deeply social, deeply feminist, and that you could express yourself, and kind of, those ideas were visualized through whether it was photography or painting or whatever medium it was. And that was really my kind of, my way in, as opposed to, Rubens or anything else that I learned at university.
So you at this time you prefer the 20th century, or it was?
Well, I mean, as I said, it was very backwards looking, and I think I can't say what other universities or educational establishments in the United Kingdom or indeed in Europe were teaching at the time, but where I was, it was very, a traditional art historical canonical teaching, and it went up until kind of the immediate post-war period, but you didn't really look at anything that felt contemporary, and I was a little bit disillusioned with that. And then and so, but there was less access to the arts. We didn't, it was right at the beginning of the internet, we didn't have computers or phones, and you had to go and see shows. And when I was studying in Scotland, you had Titians on the wall, and there was very little I didn't encounter very contemporary ways of very contemporary practices until I started in my kind of much more professional life.
So you did your bachelor and master, and did you write a thesis during your?
I did write a thesis
because sometimes a thesis, sometimes afterward we can see there is a link.
Yes. Well, actually, because I studied French and history, I spent a year in France at the École du Louvre. Where I was in my hippie phase and really connected to Asian art and contemporary Asian art as well. But I studied at the Musée Guimet at the time, and sorry, what was the
thesis?
My thesis was on Kandinsky and spirituality and theosophy. So trying to understand Kandinsky through the theosophists, so Blavatsky. I haven't thought about this in a long time, which is really interesting because of course there's a huge resurgence in thinking of kind of art as a kind of transcendental, kind of spiritual,
with the music
mode.
I think there's a lot of inspiration. For me, Kandinsky and this movement is really
I was really. So that was my dissertation was on that, although I haven't thought about it in a very long time. But it does strike me that thinking through ideas obviously of color and line and on the spirit, obviously the kind of on the spiritual in art, and they were really kind of formative ways of looking, and deeply unfashionable, I think, at that time, if I can cast my mind that back. But my dissertation was on that, and I haven't dealt really with this spiritual in art in my kind of curatorial, adventures. But yeah, a way of thinking kind of critically, trying to, I guess, always go beyond the surface of an image and thinking what was the motivation, what was the intent, what was the gap, I think, between motivation and its kind of physical manifestation. What was the artist trying to say? What was the context in which they were working? And that always really kind of, I guess, attracted me. I want to know the story, and the great thing about photography is often it tells these really kind of complex narratives and stories that often enmeshed with the biography of the artist, or certainly within the kind of socio-political environment that they're working. So yeah.
So, and at this end of this studies, you wanted to be a historian, or like what was your first job experience at the end of your?
At the end of my undergrad, my first job, I was very fortunate. I moved to Tel Aviv in Israel to follow love, as one often does when one's young. And I ended up being I got my first position at the Tel Aviv Museum of Art as a curatorial assistant, working within the kind of modern and contemporary department there, which, if I look back, was also, hugely instructive, a kind of chaotic place full of energy, but also, again, very little connection with photography. There was a photography department actually run by a really wonderful woman who's since passed away, called Nili Goren. But yeah, so that was my first job, and I was and that's when I really discovered contemporary art and contemporary ways of thinking. So they showed Catherine Yass, and a lot of the YBA work at that time was very kind of dominant, I guess, but also, sculpture, David Smith, they had lots of Lichtensteins, the kind of greats of kind of 20th century art. But there was a strong kind of, a strong photographic trend within the museum.
Everything was in English at the museum?
Well, I mean, both. I spoke some enough Hebrew, but a lot of it.
So Hebrew, like English and French.
Yeah.
Do you have some family in Tel Aviv also?
Yes. And my mother was born there. So, so I lived there for 3 years, and that was, a very formative experience. And then I came back to the UK to do my master's in curating at Goldsmiths here in London. And that was at a time when, curatorial practice was really beginning to be professionalized. It was the Royal College of Art, the RCA curating degree, had been running for, I think, 2 years or maybe 3 years at that time. And the Goldsmiths curating course, it was its second year. So it felt very new, really exciting. It was a very small cohort. And I wanted to learn about curating. I'd got the bug, and this, I'm really in. Well, I mean, I guess what pulled me was the research that a curator does. This ability to kind of dive very deeply into a subject, whether that's the artist, and kind of trace the creative arc of an artist's life, or whether it was kind of thinking discursively around a particular thematic or subject, and that was and that was really the kind of beginning of me really wanting to unpack, and it kind of as I said, it aligns or maps onto a much more kind of a professionalization of what it meant to be a curator then. And of course there were great curators out in the world doing really what was at the time seen as quite, avant-garde and cutting-edge works. I mean, you can think of Le Magicien de la Terre. I mean, there were many exhibitions that were beginning to think transhistorically, transnationally, globally, at the beginning of that point where, thinking, trying to break down or dismantle this kind of Western hegemonic approach to art history. And so, being at Goldsmiths, this very kind of febrile energy of that place in 2001, it was a very good time in the UK for the arts as well.
Why?
Because it was Tony Blair, the Labour government under Tony Blair had been voted in 1997, and it was was, I don't want to look back on it with rose-tinted glasses, but it was this halcyon days of the arts. There was funding, there was money, there was a recognition that art could be an agent of change, that it could represent a culture. I guess the then Labour government kind of harnessed the kind of the soft power potential of the arts. It was something that was exported. It was something that became it was a brand, and it felt like a really exciting time to be working in the arts.
But because you were a curator at Tel Aviv.
No, I was a curatorial assistant. So really doing the legwork, the kind of database, and
But you don't think it was essential to study at Goldsmiths, or don't you think maybe you can learn the curating job in doing it? Why do you see the need to?
Well, because at the time, so this is, I think I did my degree, my master's in 2001, and these courses, there were a handful in Europe. There was the Apple in Amsterdam, the Royal College, and Goldsmiths in the UK. I think there may have been one somewhere else, and certainly there was a couple in the States. But it was this real, early kind of moment of this professionalization of the idea that curatorial or curating could be a practice, a discursive way of thinking, and then of a kind of dialogical practice whereby, it was an investigation, exploration of the arts, and then how that is then kind of mediated, communicated, conveyed to an audience. So it was. So it's funny because I look back and it was incredibly. It was a chaotic place to be, Goldsmiths in 2001, but a really wonderful place, a space to think, an incubator of ideas. But on the other hand, I don't think it teaches you how to curate. So I would always say, don't do curating courses. Go and do philosophy or critical thinking or writing or philosophy or something that will bring you into a way of thinking critically. I think, but at the time that it was I guess it was en vogue to do them, and there were far fewer of them.
I think
it meant something.
Yeah, I think it's why I'm asking, because not all curators have done the classes, so that's why I think they've mushroomed, it's exploded as a kind of course, and then we can talk about the kind of the lack of opportunities for young curators. Very few institutions. We're now in a moment of austerity all over Europe and the States. I mean, it's different in other places in the world, but there's a retrenching of ideas and thoughts at this moment. But at that time in 2001, it was, I don't know, I felt it was the right path to take, and and a certain kind of professionalization. I mean, even though when I look back on it, what we did was network and see shows, and you could have done that without going to university, but it was within a kind of framework of thinking, and also understanding the history of exhibition making, which is really a very particular space to occupy. So did you find a job after this?
I was very fortunate. I mean, there were a few interim jobs, but I think within a year or 18 months of maybe 2 years after leaving that course, maybe 3 actually, I can't remember exactly, I joined the Barbican as an assistant curator, really quite young. I wanted to work in a Kunsthalle style environment. I wasn't drawn to collections. I really wanted to be in an environment that was kind of forward thinking, that was risk taking, that was a little bit maverick, a bit left field. And the Barbican was all of those things. It didn't follow the kind of the traditional lines of thinking in their exhibition making.
Yeah, can you just explain for the people who don't know the Barbican, like what are all the projects and how it's different from another place?
Yeah, so the Barbican is not sure what the equivalent would be in France. There isn't really one, but it's this kind of pluridisciplinary art centre. It likes to boast that it's the largest arts centre in Europe, and it houses obviously 2 galleries, a very large gallery of about 1,600 square meters, commissioning space called the Curve, but it also has 3 cinemas, 2 theatres, a concert hall with kind of, and the idea at that time was there was this kind of porosity between all of these disciplines and mediums, that they could speak to each other, that you could kind of collapse these kind of very siloed art forms, and so that felt really exciting and full of potential. And I would say that, for me, I mean, I was there a long time at the Barbican, over close to 2 decades actually, and that place and its way of thinking is certainly in my DNA. I left my heart there, but it what I really enjoyed about it was that, it was a Kunsthalle, and at the time in the UK, and I should say it has this, it's the Barbican is this kind of brutalist beacon in the United Kingdom, so it has a very distinct, quite muscular, bold architecture. And it was quite unfashionable, and it wasn't what it is seen today. It was quite an unloved space.
Space, it was because of the space.
Yeah, it was just seen as this kind of, the kind of the grammar of brutalism, the architectural grammar of brutalism, I guess, wasn't very much on vogue when I started, and that has kind of done a 360 degrees now, because it's, and always in, loads of films, and, it's endlessly kind of photographed. It's incredibly photogenic as a place. But when I started, it was quite unloved and a little bit left field. But it was quite brave and did unusual shows. And if I look back now, what they were doing it opened in 1982, and through the 80s and 90s, they were absolute pioneers of kind of photography. So the Barbican hosted the first ever show in the UK of William Eggleston. It showed Dido Moriyama and Roy de Carava and Gordon Parks and all of these people. They did a show of Faye Godwin, who, through the 90s and 2000s, I think her work was seen as kind of deeply unfashionable, kind of apolitical. I've since revisited Faye Godwin's work for a show, my last show I did at the Barbican, which was Resistors, a lens on gender and ecology. But it was more that they were doing things that felt, a bit left field, a bit maverick, kind of not following the kind of the path of other galleries. And I was really fortunate to get an early job there.
And it's public and private. What is the
so the Barbican is it's a public space, so it's a publicly funded arts centre, but it is funded primarily by the City of London, and the City of London is where it's the financial centre, not only of the UK, but pre-Brexit and maybe still post-Brexit. It is still the kind of, the beating heart of Europe's financial kind of activity. So it's a relatively wealthy municipality, local council, and it pumped money into the Barbican. So there was means, we had, budgetary possibilities to do things. We were well funded, and there was a level of ambition that felt exciting, and everything was possible. And it's not run in quite the same way as other museums and galleries in London, because that's really where my experience is. So there was a kind of creative agency, and because it was unfashionable, you could do things that felt slightly off kilter.
Yeah, and I think it's there are not a lot of public space when you can have this liberty. So I think it was really...
it was amazing, and that's why I stayed. And each show was given time to. It was given gestational time, so you had time to research, travel, and bring a diversity and plurality of voices together to create a show that was unlikely and unusual, and so it was an amazing platform to have.
And how did your role evolve around over time?
Over the I mean, I guess there was at the time a director called Kate Bush, who had a very brilliant kind of curatorial vision and voice, and had a particular affinity to photography. And as I said, photography has always been, a kind of, an important strand in the gallery at the Barbican's program. And so I learned photography from her. I worked on a few shows with her. I think I can't even remember the earliest ones. But we showed, I think maybe in, it must have been earlier when I can't remember, but we did shows with Anne Miley, Paul Chan, Boris Mikhailov. I mean, group shows, Craigie Horsfield, Wolfgang Tillmans, Ernest Cole, David Goldblatt, Bruce Davidson. There were this kind of, so it was a brilliant school into photography, because I had really come from a contemporary art background, with a deep commitment to time-based media. I loved film, and then under the kind of under Kate, I guess, who now no longer practices as a curator, but so I learned kind of photography through her, I guess, tutelage or mentorship at the time. And and it was also, I was attracted or drawn to photography not only for the language of photography, its capacity to tell stories, kind of long form stories, to be kind of international and global in its thinking, kind of to travel to different places and see different experience kinds of reflected back at us. But I also found the photography community very generous. And so the contemporary art world at the time felt exclusive and perhaps not as welcoming. And the photography world, because the economy around photography is so different, there was less at stake. And so the people who were part of that community were there for the passion, the belief, the commitment to the form, to the kind of photographic medium. And that was really intoxicating. You could meet artists from all over, and they didn't have the same sense, maybe, I don't want to use the word entitlement, but a different a different relationship to their practice, because it wasn't in the millions, it was in the thousands.
And do you think things have changed? Because you say in the past. So do you think like the atmosphere in the photography's field?
No. I think it is still really. I don't think it's changed. It's grown exponentially. It's exploded. There's been a revival of the kind of the photo book that's got its whole other kind of community of people and brilliant publishers. When I started, there were far fewer publishers who were looking at Steidl. Mac was still an imprint of Steidl, or Mac was still at Steidl. Everything was smaller, I guess. It was much more but no, I think that spirit of community building, and partly it's because photography often, I mean, I sound like I'm a bit nostalgic, and I'm not, because looking back, obviously I recognize that a lot of the photographers and voices that were being platformed, were the kind of, obviously, cis white male perspective. So it's not, but so I'm not kind of blinkered by that, but it's nonetheless a art form that that is about going out into the world and creating connections and kind of coalition building. And I love that idea of coalition building, of solidarity, of community. And I think that also really attracted me. So I had the photo bug quite early on. So I was fortunate. And also what I really liked about the Barbican, which is, I do think is still a problem around photography, is this kind of ghettoization of photography in kind of medium specific spaces. And the joy of working at somewhere like the Barbican is that you could, it was so cross-disciplinary, so it wasn't unusual to see a photograph alongside a painting, alongside a sculpture, and to kind of recontextualize it and revalue that image making within a kind of wider visual culture. And I love that. And I still believe today that photography, you can go around frieze, and very often, you might only see one or two photographs across the totality of the fair. And I think those boundaries have still not collapsed, but it lives in photography and it lives in kind of contemporary art. This idea that there's a kind of, a kind of barrier or border between ways of thinking and ways of seeing. And the Barbican was an opportunity to try and kind of collapse those, and I still love that.
And what was your role as a curator? Like, I think it can be interesting for the people who want to be a curator. Like, what are the many steps to do an exhibition? Like, because I think you are working with other departments. So
yeah. So no, I mean, again, I'm not being utopian. The Barbican, you lived in your kind of art silo, so it's not that. Although there were, it was cross-disciplinary because, of course, these conversations are happening around a kind of cultural discourse, and that can apply to music in different ways, or to, kind of theatre, or clearly to cinema, where there is a strong synergy. But my role was really to, I was, given the opportunity to curate really ambitious shows.
How many shows per year, photography shows do you?
Well, I think I did one every other year, because there's a lot of research that goes into, I often describe curatorial work as you're like a bit of a detective, but also a magpie. So you're a magpie because you're constantly seeing and collecting images, names, ideas. Ideas get sparked, but you're also a detective because you're looking and going out and finding the work and particular loans, and it's this incredible puzzle that comes together. And then, there's obviously the space in which you're curating, which very much dictates how you curate, what you curate, who your audience is, who you're speaking to. So I believe that kind of, curatorial practice is very much this kind of, there's a trifecta of relationships. There's, the institution, and by that I mean the curator, although the institutional ethics and ideologies now play an even greater role in the kind of thought process of a curator. There's the idea perhaps that you're working with, and then the artist within that, or whether you're working on a monographic show, and then of course the audience. You've got, who are you speaking to? What does that space that you inhabit, who does that audience, who does that institution speak to? And I often say that, I think that if I'd been a curator in a different institution, I think my practice, or my method or mood of working would have been very different, because the Barbican has its own architectural specificity, and you had to work, in conversation with that. And so it dictates to a degree what you show, how you show it, why you show it. Is it going to look good in that space? And then there's, of course, but I guess ultimately the curator is wanting, you've got there's an artist whose work you think needs to be shown, and kind of in its complete, whether it's a retrospective show, a survey show, and they are different, or whether it's a thematic show where an idea that you feel is really it's got the zeitgeist, or that you feel has been underexplored, underrepresented, underthought about. And then it's really about your approach to how you bring all of those different variables together.
Yeah, and you also have some shows who traveled, who also exhibit.
Most of the shows at the Barbican, I think, have travelled across Europe. So Masculinities, Liberation Through Photography, it travelled to FOMU in Antwerp, and obviously to Les Rencontres d'Arles, de la photographie d'Arles, I guess. And I did a show called Resistors, a Lens on Gender and Ecology, and that also travelled to FOMU in Antwerp. And then, I think the Dorothea Lange travelled to the Jeux de Paume in Paris. And then shows have travelled here within the UK as well. And then obviously there's this commissioning aspect of the work that I was doing at the Barbican. So, I worked with Richard Moss. We co-commissioned his incredible project Incoming, this, in kind of complex filmic representation of the migrant crisis from kind of 2015 to 2018. 2014 to 2017, and he went out, to the world using this, advanced military technology of thermal imaging to kind of document, record, migrants traveling from across the Sahel or from Syria through Lesbos, through all sorts of places. So commissioning was also a really important aspect of the work that I was, given the privilege of doing at the Barbican. And I worked with Trevor Paglin. We commissioned a site-specific commission in the Curve, and I should say that the Curve is this kind of 90-meter long crescent-shaped space in the Curve, of free space. It's like a canyon. Its walls are 6 meters high, and it's kind of episodic. Because it's a curve, you can't see the end from the beginning. So it has this, so it was again an incredible space in which to invite artists to kind of dream up these, wildly ambitious projects that we were able to deliver and work on for 18 months, for 2 years. And so because of the scale of things at the Barbican, it demanded time, and because it was well funded, you had the luxury of time to do that. And you had the financial means to bring those artists and those works together in a space. So it was an enormous a privilege, and then really to think about how do we represent contemporary photography in that space, and how do we and I always wanted to do shows that felt very intergenerational. So the group shows, so whether it was Masculinities or Resistors most recently, they start in the kind of 60s and they go through to the very present, because I felt that the canon of contemporary photography is still being written. It's such a new art form. I mean it's getting less and less new, and but it's a constantly evolving art form where its history is still being written, and of course, and is being written today in a way by wonderful curators out there who bring a kind of very kind of a very kind of, I guess, feminist or activist approach to their work. And so it's a really exciting field in which to be.
And do you change things when, for instance, when an exhibition is exhibited at the Barbican, and after for instance, goes to Les Rencontres d'Arles, do you, like, it's you adapt, or it's another group of people? Or
no, it's always the curator, because it's so, particularly with thematic shows, and I was very invested in masculinities and very invested in resistors. And so, it's your baby. You've worked on it for 2.5, maybe sometimes 3 years. You've been thinking about this sometimes even longer. And every work seems critical and crucial and nothing can be omitted. And it's those conversations between artworks that feels so important. And so, absolutely. I was implicated in every single time a show toured because everything is done with intent, so you're not just bringing together artists, and you're bringing together a group of artists whose work are in dialogue with each other, and the conversations that they're having between those works are absolutely critical to your kind of curatorial way of thinking, or the ideas that you're trying to convey through the works of artists who have been thinking about these subjects for a long time. So yes, to answer your question, I was absolutely implicated, because you feel a responsibility to the show, you feel a responsibility to the artists with whom you continue to have relationships, and you want it to be the best show it can be. So yeah, absolutely. And and each time a show, and you see different things, and every time a show travels and it comes in to contact with a different space and different architectural space, a different kind of context, a different audience, it means different things to different people. And how does it travel? And, how do you, the interpretation? So when Masculinities traveled to Arles, there was a lot of conversation around gendered language. In the UK, in the English language, it's not quite as kind of gendered as the French language. And so that was really interesting to think about. How do we translate that? How do we have inclusive language? How can we, and all of those conversations and all of those attempts, failed or not, are about kind of pushing everything forward, pushing that conversation forward, about whether in this case it was around gender nonconformity and masculinity and kind of queering masculinity, all of those things. But language is absolutely embedded in the visual arts as well, even though it uses a different vocabulary, but it's equally important.
And you became a director of the Art Council collection. What is the Art Council collection? Because I think a lot of people, maybe not the people who live in the UK, know exactly what it is. And what are your priorities in this new position? Because director, we don't really.
So I guess
what it is and what is your role?
Yeah. So the Arts Council collection is, I guess, the closest equivalent in France would be the CNAP. So the Centre National d'Art Plastique. And so it's a museum without walls. So it's a collection that was started in 1946 in the immediate post-war period, with a kind of mission to collect what at the time they termed kind of experimental art. So in this moment of in this post-war kind of traumatic moment, 1946, you have a lot of artists. The canon, it was a rupture. I mean, the Second World War was such a kind of disruption to kind of traditional ways of thinking, and artists come back and are beginning to work through ideas of trauma and beginning to, think in different ways. And the Arts Council collection was established to start to support contemporary artists and to acquire those works on behalf of the United Kingdom, so all 4 nations at the time, with the intent to ensure that those works, so what they termed experimental art at the time, so they were buying very early Francis Bacon, David Hockney and so on, were being shown outside of the kind of metropolitan hub of London. So the idea was to acquire the kind of most cutting edge avant-garde work being made in the UK at the time, and then to ensure that it was seen and to celebrate and champion contemporary practice. And that remains the continued mission of the collection. But it is a museum without walls, so it is a collection. So I've moved from the most Kunsthalle-y, diametrically opposite space of this gargantuan brutalist space with no collection and very much a curatorial practice, to a very British-based collection with no walls, and it was a bit of a culture shock, I have to admit. But the amazing thing about the collection is that it continues to acquire work and to grow annually. And so this year we bought about 50 works. Last year I think it was 39 or something. But it's a commitment to acquiring us, and I should say that often acquiring artists when they're really emerging or younger, or by mid-career, but or overlooked, those that have been kind of historically excluded. So we are not buying the blue chip artists. It's really about kind of finding those artists of tomorrow, but who are still good today, excellent, really exciting today. But and then ensuring that work is collected, and very often the artists who are accessioned into the collection, their works, it's very often it's the first time they've ever been in a national collection, and so it's a really exciting place, very different, really exciting place.
It's visual art.
So it's across all disciplines. So it's across painting, photography, works on paper, sculpture, film, some performance, installation. It has a really important collection of sculpture. And it has a really good photography collection as well. And it's a very idiosyncratic, very British collection. But what's really interesting is you can map the much like you probably could in most museums that but you can kind of map the evolution of thinking or of kind of of artistic practice onto the collection over the last 80 years, and you can tell kind of the story and what's been omitted and what's been left out, who's been excluded. So look, it's as interesting to look as what's in there as to what's not in there sometimes.
And many people work at the Art Council collection. It's like it's big as the Barbican, or you move from a big team from...
absolutely. So I've changed. It couldn't be, as I said, more diametrically opposite. So going from this kind of very large, complex institution to what is a very small organization. We are just about 20 people, and the collection is owned by the Arts Council England, which is the kind of funding body for the art government, for government money to the arts. So it's their own kind of cultural asset, I guess. And but it plays a really important role in the arts ecosystem, especially now when arts funding is so restricted and it's very challenging. So it can be a brilliant collection for younger artists.
And your role as a director of
my role as a director. Well, at the moment the collection is decanting. It's grown too large for its current storage facility, so the primary focus is to move. There's about 8,500 works in the collection.
Okay.
So the primary focus at the moment is to move that collection to a new storage facility outside of London. So there's a lot of collection management. I mean, I've learned lots, and obviously to direct the team, and but also to think about how that the collection is activated. So the collection is activated through not only acquiring and supporting artists through acquisitions, but also through exhibitions and through a lot of loans. So at the moment, we've got a really beautiful early David Hockney work called Two Boys Together Clinging from 1961 on show at the Fondation Louis Vuitton as part of the David Hockney show, a work that the collection bought while David Hockney was still at the Royal College of Art, so still a student. So it's about loans going out. So very much kind of collection focused, acquisition focused.
Conservation. I think maybe you also have a lot of question about.
Yes, conservation. Everything that goes into a collection. So I have, I really felt that after nearly 2 decades at the Barbican, it was maybe time to shift focus and to shift gear, and I'd never worked in a collection I thought it would be really interesting and a new challenge to do that. I mean, I still curate shows and and still work very closely with photographers and photography, and and I'm trying to ensure that more photographers are acquired by the collection. So this year we've acquired several young British or UK based photographers. So that's my commitment to photography is absolutely still alive and kicking, just in a different way. But and I think that photography is at an inflection point. It's at a moment, maybe crisis is too strong a word, but certainly an inflection point, a kind of a malaise. I think it's got to do with I think there's certainly a kind of COVID moment, this idea that our lives became very two-dimensional, screen-based, and that there's a kind of stronger desire or human need for the physical object, for something that feels haptic and tactile, and I see that there are a lot of artists who are working with lots of different kind of materials in their work, kind of experimenting, testing things out, thinking through what an expanded photographic practice could look like. But and then of course there's the kind of just the explosion of digital imagery and the potentiality of that, and what does it mean to take a good photograph, a great photograph, citizen journalism, all of those things, so of course there's been a kind of a demise of kind of not necessarily editorial, but certainly photojournalism, because now everyone's a citizen journalist and a kind of citizen photojournalist. And I think that, photography is also not necessarily a crisis of confidence, but this idea in this kind of post-truth world in which we're living, and this kind of AI world. But there's a crisis of confidence. And also, of course, we've got, the artist biography and identity is so central. And I think there are lots of reasons why there's an inflection point.
And do you think what can be the different paths after this crisis? Or
I don't know. I mean, photography is endlessly reinventing itself. So, but I see that there's I think I guess I can only talk about what I'm really interested in, and I'm really interested in terms of kind of practices that are collage, for example. I've written quite a lot about collage recently, but collage is this way of kind of making sense of all the images that exist in the world, this kind of appropriation and reassembling, and kind of and I see it as a very kind of feminist and decentering practice. So I think there's a kind of a pull towards kind of rethinking imagery. There's also a lot of thinking around kind of ecological issues, and so there's a lot of artists who are beginning to experiment with different materials, different types of papers, different types of printing processes that are again pushing the medium forward. There are artists like Richard Moss who are always kind of experimenting with different technologies, obsolete technologies, kind of very different ways of looking and different ways of cameras, or indeed, artists such as Trevor Paglin, who, have a very research-based, but thinking through, how do we see machine vision and all of those things. So it's an exciting time to be, but I still nonetheless think that there's it's in a knot and it's trying to unravel itself. And what are the ethics of kind of photographing on the street? What are the ethics of war photography? All of those things, all of those questions feel very, not necessarily contentious, but very alive at the moment. And in painting or in, they're not that they don't have the same questions, but they can be resolved in different ways, because it's often a studio-based practice, and photography is always I think one of the most interesting mediums, because it's always in dialogue, often with the outside world, and that's what makes it move forward, and that's what's exciting. But it also means that it's also mired in the kind of ideologies of today, and it can get hijacked and taken hostage for different reasons, and it can be propagandist, and there are so many other, photography can be kind of, I guess, harnessed in different ways. And so I think it's I think it's in it's looking back, and it's not to say that in the 80s they didn't have that with kind of word and image, and how much does how much do we rely on the image within this kind of frame to tell us only kind of a half truth or a half version of a story, and it needed text to kind of to counterbalance the image. And so I think we're in a similar kind of inflection point with photography. There are just so many more ways to make it, and there are so many more photographers to tell those stories. And then you really have to, I think very carefully about the mode in which you're working and the political space in which you're working. And by that I mean, what are the politics when you're photographing in a landscape? What does it mean for a photographer or an artist to be in that space, representing the space? What are the kind of the larger political space in which you're in? And then, of course, there's the politics of photography itself, this kind of with its ethnographic history, its kind of colonial history, the fact that it's an extractive, that silver gelatin print, it uses materials from the earth that's about extraction. So how do we think through those ideas of kind of ecology? How do we think through those ideas of kind of, social responsibility, and all of those questions that I think are, all endlessly kind of fascinating.
So a lot of artists who also work with technologies, and so it's a big question, but what do you think about like AI in photography, like we are in 2025, where do you think it's going? Do you think it's I don't know.
Well, I mean, I'm deeply old-fashioned, I think, and I've really had to. I judge quite a lot of prizes, and I'm sit on many juries, and so I have the pleasure of seeing a lot of work. I've just come back from being on the jury of the Grand Prix for the Image Rêvée in Switzerland with Veronica Dijkstra, who was the president, and with Lewis Chaplin from Loose Joints, and from Ola Remy on a banjo, also from the Museum of Modern Art in New York, from MoMA, and with Urs Steil, the Swiss curator who was the founder of the Winterthur. And so I get to see a lot of work, and AI is again, it goes through kind of phases. So sometimes you see tons of AI, artists beginning to work with AI and test its limits and test, but I'm deeply suspicious of it, and I think artists have to constantly be incredibly creative to work with it in a way that feels meaningful. So when, for instance, Trevor Paglin, who, not that he plays with AI, but he's thinking through kind of machine vision, algorithms, and the kind of biases embedded in data sets, image data sets, word data sets, and that's fascinating because it's really about unpacking and unraveling the politics that are embedded in a way of seeing, and I'm really fascinated in that aspect. But whether AI can generate a good photograph, I've yet to be convinced. But it is an exciting technology. I know. I just feel that maybe I'm not a digital native, and it's not for me.
I think we are in a time where when we speak a lot about AI, because AI is really, I think, in the life of everybody, more and more. So that's why I think we are like thinking, maybe photography. But I think maybe in, I don't know, 5-10 years we will have more feedbacks, and we will really see what it is like. And as you said, I think it needs to have a meaning, like really it has
a deep meaning, and because you I mean, it's Yeah, I mean, and I think it's always important to think about, exactly where have these images, when it's an AI generated image, where have these images been sourced from? What do they mean? I mean, really interestingly, actually, in respect to that, there's an artist who's done this kind of a parody book. Who's an artist, a female photographer, whose name I now don't remember, but she made a book that's kind of a parody of Alex Soth's Sleeping by the Mississippi, and she's called it Sleeping by the Data Flow. And what she does is she describes an Alex Soth image as a prompt into AI, and it generates an image using this kind of the ingredients that are in an Alex Soth image. But one really interesting photograph in that book, and I'm not saying that parody is good or anything, but what's really interesting in that particular book, and apologies, I don't remember the name of the artist, but is that there's in Sleeping by the Mississippi by Alex Soth, there's a really striking, arresting image of a young man, kind of a portrait shot of a young white man in an American prison. And this artist has put into AI young man in prison, and the image that is generated is an image of a man of color.
Okay.
Which I think is so powerful to talk about the bias embedded in AI, because she deliberately didn't talk about the color of the subject, and yet the AI has kind of vomited out this kind of image, so it plays into all of those prejudices and biases that are then embedded into kind of the algorithms and all of that. So for me, that's super fascinating, because it's a really kind of physical manifestation of the bias embedded, all that prejudice. So so it's interesting as a reflection of society more than interesting as a kind of image making machine.
Yeah, because the algorithm is not done by magic; it's done by people. So it's all the
absolutely.
I mean, because it's American white people who build this algorithm.
White educated cis men sitting in Stanford or wherever it is, kind of bringing in these. And that's exactly what it is. So so as a reflection of the biases embedded in society, that image is particularly interesting.
My last question is in two parts. It's what advice would you give to emerging curators of young professionals who wants to work in the field of photography, and for photographer? Because I think you meet a lot of people, so maybe if you have some advice for people who want to be curator and people who want to work in the photography industry.
Yep. So for young curator or emerging curatorial voices, my advice is to keep working. And what I mean by that is write a blog post, go and see shows, write a critical piece of writing, even if it's only for your own website, curate a talk. You don't have to think, it doesn't have to be big and bold on the first go. Build it up slowly, but continue to be practicing, to be out in the world, to be kind of thinking critically and reflectively about your practice. Trust yourself and your subject position, and by that I mean go with your gut instinct. It's okay not to have a relationship with a particular image, but why do you not? Or what are you, think about the exhibition design, what did you like, what don't you like, but I guess I'm saying, because it's so competitive out there in the museum and gallery world right now, and so don't be downhearted, but to keep writing, to do your own projects, even if it's just a small show in a cafe. Get that experience, think about it with kind of intention and consciously create, be part of collectives. See as much as you can. And don't be afraid to ask questions, but also just don't be afraid to do things. I know it's really hard, but that is always my advice, is just to, if you're at university, try and curate a show in the university gallery, get some work experience. And again, I know that's really difficult, but it's important to find your own voice and to trust yourself. And that's something that you learn only by doing, and you learn what works and what doesn't work. And, you know, I've done lots of shows, and I started, you know, doing quite offbeat shows in other spaces and other places, and some of them I, you know, and worked with really brilliant young artists, and that was really formative, and I learned a lot about myself, because you have to write and you have to defend your position, and always think about what it is that you really like about this work. What is it? How does it speak to you, and how does it speak to the other works that you're potentially putting it in conversation with? So I would just say, keep going, don't be downtrodden. I know it's hard. And with photographers, I think it's the same. You know, I think it's just a really competitive world out there, and it's hard to have your voice heard or your photographs seen. Go and do portfolio reviews, apply for prizes. There are lots of prizes out there in the world, and having, you know, I do a lot, as I said, I do a lot of juries, so I particularly in Europe, and part of that jury responsibility is to look at all of the nominations, to discuss them. So even when artists aren't selected or shortlisted or you know, are the kind of receive the prize or whatever, you know, those curators who are around the table are looking at the work and they're discussing the work, and that is equally meaningful, because it might not have been right for this prize, but it will be in the back of your mind, maybe something that you loved or something that you connected to. So go for prizes. I know they can be expensive. Go to, you know, try for residencies, try, you know, just be active. Don't give up hope. I know it's really difficult, and continue to experiment. I guess that, you know, but I recognize that, you know, I wouldn't want to be a young curator in the world today. I think it's really, really challenging, and
more challenging than when you started. You think?
Yes, I think so.
Because more people.
There's more people. There's a much clearer understanding of what curating is. I think visual culture has exploded. More people are going to museums. I think it's, you know, I can say for the UK, and I think it's probably the same around most places. But, you know, when Tate Modern opened, you know, it had 6 million visitors in its first year, and it thought it would only have 2 or 3. I can't remember the figures, but there is we are much more visually literate and sophisticated than we were, and that's because of Instagram, and that's because of, you know, endless kind of, you know, Netflix, you know, all of those things that kind of feed into our lives, and so I know it's really hard, but yeah, and Instagram is a really fantastic platform. Use it, connect with people, follow, reach out, post, blog. It has its own ideological complexities, but we'll leave that aside. But yeah, so that would be my advice.
Thank you, Alona. Thank you for your time, for the advice. I think you gave very good information about your work and how to be a curator, and so thank you.
My absolute pleasure. I realise there's lots we didn't discuss: curatorial activism, all sorts of things. But yeah, I think thank you so much for the invitation to participate. I'm in a long list of very esteemed curators, so I'm very grateful.
Thank you, Alona.
Pleasure. Bye.
Thank you for listening to Les Voix de la Photo. In the notes of this episode, you will find a sign-up link to receive the Voix de la Photo newsletter. Sorry, it's in French, at least for now. Every 2 weeks, you will get a summary of the latest episode, exclusive content, my recommendation for reading, exhibitions, or conferences, and sometimes even gifts. Also, to help spread the word about the podcast, I'll invite you to leave a comment and 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. If you want to share your thoughts, suggest people you would like to hear, or learn more, you can follow me on social media, on Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook. See you soon!